Spring Boot. Unable to start Embedded Web Application Context due to missing Embedded Servlet Container Factory bean introduction. A common Spring Boot startup error is unable to start Embedded Web Application Context due to missing Embedded Servlet Container Factory bean. This error usually happens when Spring Boot tries to start a web application, but it cannot find the bean responsible for creating the embedded servlet container. In older Spring Boot versions, that bean was called Embedded Servlet Container Factory. In newer Spring Boot versions, the equivalent is Servlet Web Server Factory. This is an important topic because it affects whether your Spring Boot application can start with an embedded server, like Tomcat, Jetty, Undertow. Understanding this error helps you fix startup issues related to missing dependencies, wrong application type, incorrect configuration version mismatches. What does this error mean? It means Spring Boot is trying to run your application as a web application, but it cannot find the bean that creates the embedded server. In simple terms, Spring Boot wants to start Tomcat Jetty means required server factory bean not found, means startup fails. Example concept. App starts means Spring expects embedded server means factory bean missing, means error, why this happens. For a Spring Boot web application to start, Spring needs an embedded servlet container factory bean. That factory creates and configures the embedded server. Examples: Tomcat factory, Jetty factory, Undertow factory. If Spring cannot find such a bean, the web context cannot start. Example concept. No web server factory bean means no embedded server, means web app cannot run. Common root cause. The most common reason is missing web starter dependency. If your project does not include Spring Boot Starter Web, then Spring Boot may not have the embedded Tomcat setup needed to start a web application. Example problem. Suppose your code has Spring Boot application, public class application, public static void main string args, Spring application.run application.class args. And you also have controllers like REST controller, public class, hello controller, get mapping, /hello, public string hello, return hello, but your pom.xml is missing the web starter. Then, Spring Boot may fail to start the embedded web context. Main cause 1. Missing Spring Boot Starter Web, wrong setup. Your project may include only dependency, group ID, org.springframework.boot group ID, artifact ID, Spring Boot Starter, artifact ID, but not dependency, group ID, org.springframework.boot, artifact ID, Spring Boot Starter Web, artifact ID. Add a dependency, group ID, org springframework.boot, group ID, artifact ID, Spring Boot Starter Web, artifact ID. Example concept. Web starter added means embedded Tomcat available, means app starts. Why Spring Boot Starter Web fixes it. This starter usually brings Spring MVC embedded Tomcat servlet support, web auto configuration. Example concept. Web starter means Tomcat factory bean auto configured. So, once the dependency is included, Spring Boot can create the required bean automatically. Main cause 2. Wrong dependency exclusions. Sometimes developers exclude Tomcat accidentally. Example. Dependency. Group ID, org springframework.boot, group ID, artifact ID, Spring Boot Starter Web, artifact ID. Exclusion. Exclusion. Group ID, org springframework.boot, artifact ID, Spring Boot Starter Tomcat, artifact ID. Exclusion. If you exclude Tomcat and do not add Jetty or Undertow, the application has no embedded server. Fix. Either keep Tomcat or add another supported server, like Jetty/Undertow. Example concept. Tomcat removed, plus no replacement means no server factory bean. Main cause 3. Mixing old and new Spring Boot versions. This exact error message often appears in older Spring Boot versions. Older versions use Embedded Servlet Container Factory. Newer versions use Servlet Web Server Factory. If dependencies are mixed incorrectly across versions, startup problems can happen. Example concept. Old API plus new dependencies, or vice versa, means version mismatch issues. Fix. Make sure all Spring Boot dependencies use the same compatible version. Main cause 4. Application is configured as web but should not be. Sometimes the application is not really supposed to be a web app. For example, command line app batch job utility service. But Spring Boot still tries to start a servlet web context. Fix. If it is not a web application, set spring.main.webApplicationType equals none. Or in code, Spring application app equals new Spring application, application.class. App set web application type, web application type.none. App run args. Example concept. Not a web app means disable web mode, means no embedded server needed. Main cause 5, using Spring Boot Starter Webflux instead of MVC. If your app uses reactive stack, Webflux instead of servlet-based MVC, the setup is different. If you intended to use a normal servlet web app, but only added Spring Boot Starter Webflux, then your configuration may not match your code expectations. Example concept. Reactive setup equals servlet container setup. Fix. Use the correct starter for your app type. Spring Boot Starter Web for Spring MVC servlet apps. Spring Boot Starter Webflux for reactive apps. Main cause 6. Custom configuration broke auto configuration. Sometimes custom configuration disables or interferes with Boot's web server setup. Examples. Excluding important auto configurations, custom application context setup. Unusual manual bean configuration. If Boot's autoconfig does not run properly, the server factory bean may not be created. Example concept. Autoconfig disabled means server factory bean not created. Old versus new class name. Older Spring Boot Embedded Servlet Container Factory. Newer Spring Boot Servlet Web Server Factory. Example concept. Old name in old boot versions means renamed in newer boot versions. So, if you see this older error, it often means older boot version, old stack traces, legacy tutorials code example, fix in Maven correct dependency setup, dependencies, dependency, group ID, org spring framework.boot, group ID, artifact ID, Spring Boot Starter Web artifact ID. Example concept. Starter added means boot auto configures embedded server example fix in Gradle dependencies. Implementation, org Spring Framework, boot Spring Boot Starter Web, real-world scenario. Suppose you created a Spring Boot application and added @REST controller, get mapping, main class, but forgot the web dependency. When the app starts, Spring expects web environment, no embedded servlet container bean exists. Application startup fails. Fix. Add Spring Boot Starter Web. Then, Tomcat starts application context, loads REST endpoints become available. Example concept. Missing web starter means startup failure. Add web starter means successful startup. How embedded server bean is normally created. You usually do not create this bean manually. Spring Boot auto-configures it when proper dependencies are present. For example, Tomcat means boot creates Tomcat server factory bean. Jetty means boot creates Jetty server factory bean. Undertow means boot creates Undertow server factory bean. Example concept. Dependencies decide which server factory bean boot creates. Common mistakes. 1. Missing web starter. Most common issue. 2. Excluding Tomcat without replacement. Removes embedded server support. 3. Dependency version mismatch. Old and new boot libraries mixed together. 4. Treating non-web app as web app. Spring tries to start a web server unnecessarily. 5. Breaking auto configuration. Manual exclusions or custom setup can prevent server factory bean creation. Best practices. Best practices include: use Spring Boot Starter Web for MVC web apps. Keep Spring Boot dependency versions aligned. Avoid excluding embedded server unless intentional. Use spring.main.webApplicationType equals none for non-web apps. Prefer Spring Boot auto configuration over manual setup. Example concept. Correct starter plus correct app type plus aligned versions equals successful startup. Advantages of understanding this error. Once you understand this error, you can debug startup issues faster, configure web and non-web apps correctly, manage dependencies more safely, avoid broken embedded server setups, understand boot auto configuration better. Example concept. Better dependency knowledge means faster Spring Boot troubleshooting challenges. This issue can be confusing because the message looks low-level, old and new Spring Boot class names differ. The real cause is often just one missing dependency. Custom exclusions may hide the problem. Example concept. Simple root cause means confusing startup error concepts. Learned. By learning this topic, you understand. Key. What Embedded Servlet Container Factory means. Key. Why Spring Boot needs an embedded server factory bean. Key. Why missing Spring Boot starter web causes startup failure. Key. How excluded Tomcat or wrong dependencies break startup. Key. Difference between old and new Spring Boot server factory names. Applications correctly. Simple definition. Unable to start embedded web application context due to missing embedded servlet container factory bean. A Spring Boot startup error that occurs when the application is trying to run as a web app, but no embedded servlet container factory bean is available to create the server. Final summary. The error, unable to start embedded web application context due to missing embedded servlet container factory bean, means Spring Boot is trying to start a servlet-based web application, but it cannot find the embedded server factory needed to create Tomcat, Jetty, or Undertow. The most common fix is to add the correct dependency. Spring Boot starter web. Other possible causes include excluding Tomcat without adding another server dependency, version mismatch, treating a non-web app as a web app, breaking boot auto configuration. Once you understand this issue, it becomes much easier to fix Spring Boot startup problems related to embedded server setup.